let's get started. Today we are continuing our series. We're in part 5. It's really more like a part 6, right? Because we took 2 weeks to discuss free will. But this is the evidential argument from evil. So last time we got together, we talked about the logical argument from evil, right? The argument was simply this, that if evil exists, God cannot exist. They say it's a logical contradiction. We exposed last week how that is actually not necessarily true. Well, not last week, the week before. Sorry, I was not here last week. My daughter had us up all night, sicker than a dog, last week. So we called it a day. It was my daughter's birthday, and she was just nasty sick. So we skipped. We played hooky from church. I apologize. But otherwise, what we're doing is the evidential argument from evil. This is a different argument than the logical. So they're saying it's a logical contradiction. Now they're saying actually a loving and all-powerful God probably is incoherent in light of evil. So now this is. Did you notice how this is a much weaker statement? All right, like it's a weaker statement. It's not as strong as a logical, but sometimes the better arguments aren't as strong as others, right? If you make a really strong statement, it can mean that it can get easily debunked. So an all-loving and all-powerful God, I love how I typoed this, is probably incoherent in the light of evil, or at least is far less likely. So they're just making a weaker case, but they're saying that, hey, just based on the evidence, he probably does not exist. Okay? So saying it is far less likely that God exists is a softer argument from the logical argument we've already discussed. So championed in modern works by the atheist William Rowe, the evidential argument from evil seeks to demonstrate that it is highly improbable that God exists in light of evil. So it's important to this argument is the idea of gratuitous evil. Remember, this what seems like purposeless evil. So evil or suffering that has no discernible purpose, right? Just really horrible things that happen. So while atheists approach the subject in a variety of ways, most of them tend to highlight the fact that there is so much evil. In other words, couldn't God have simply created a world with less evil and still accomplish his greater goods? That's what they're saying. God is real. So, well, atheists, so the defeater, remember we said that we can, with the logical argument, we can just bring up defeater. Just a simple possibility, not even something we believe, but a possibility that debunks the proposed logical contradiction. So defeaters here will not work with the evidential argument. So I want you guys to understand that when someone goes, God cannot exist if there's evil, all you have to do is go, well, God could have a purpose for this, or God could have given mankind freedom, or things like that. You have defeaters you can use. And this year, now you need to use those things that we talked about called theodicies. Okay? So we need to use things that we think are actual responses. Okay? So defeaters and theodicies, you use them at different times, but at times they might be combined. But I would say something like this. This is where the idea of being a truly free creature, or the free will, also known as a free will theodicy, can serve as a proper defeater against it. You can use those things that we went over, the heaven theodicy and the soul building theodicy. Does that make sense? So we can use that as a response. First off, though, let's examine what atheists say about this. And do I have? Yeah. So the idea here is that God could have prevented evil and suffering, and that if God could have prevented it, because he's all good, he would prevent the occurrence of suffering. Make sense? That's what they're trying to say. So that God could and that he would. Now, I think now that we've explored this a little bit on the Christian side, we can already see where some of the errors would be. Could God have prevented evil and suffering? Not if he created truly free creatures. Then he cannot, right? Because if they're truly free, for him to stop them would be for him to infringe on the freedom he gave them, making the freedom null and void, defeating the purpose of the creation. Make sense? And then also says that God would prevent the occurrence of suffering. But again, that makes the same brings up the same problem. So he could not, and this makes people really nervous when they say God could not do something. But if God created truly free creatures, he could not have prevented evil and suffering, or they're not free. And then again, he would not prevent all the occurrence of evil and suffering because, again, that would defeat the purpose of freedom. Does that make sense? So just so you know, these are the premises that they're using, and it makes people very nervous when you say God could not have done something. But that's okay, because God cannot lie either, right? There are some things God cannot do. He can't create square circles. We've already been over this. So in this, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being, they would say, could have prevented, without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Another thing they say on point 2 here is, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent and could not do, would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering if he could, unless he could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So again, that's exactly what that's saying there. So many atheists like to tell you what this God they don't believe in would do. That is kind of the irony here, right? They like to tell you what the God they don't believe in would do, which kind of is a little self-defeating. It kind of creates some awkwardness there. And they make the mistake of assuming how God would operate. I've had many conversations with people, well, God would do this, well, God would do that. Well, how do you know that? Especially as a non-theologian yourself, as they sometimes call themselves atheologians, if that's what you are, then you really have no basis on by which to measure God, because you really just make God whatever you think makes most sense, but not always what makes sense with God, okay? So they make the mistake of assuming how God would operate. They make themselves God in these instances, right? Because they are making themselves what they're basically trying to shape God in their own image, just because God won't do that which they want. So that must mean that he does not exist.
Well,
right?
Who does that?
A lot of the atheists nowadays, because what they're saying is that, well, if God is real, this is the way he would do it. But the problem is that they don't know that, because they don't even believe in that God, and which God are they even talking about at that point? So the problem is they're presupposing their own view of how things should be onto God, which...
What if you just don't know if there's a God? I mean, not necessarily evil.
Right, well, that's not it. That would be an agnostic claim, not an atheist claim.
I mean, in the scheme of things, I don't know. That's why I'm here.
Right. Well, that's the agnostic claim. Agnostics say we don't know. Atheists say this is what they think God would do if God was real. So the atheist is making a claim that God does not exist. And agnostic says we don't know.
All right.
So I'm only referring to atheist claims here because they're the ones who bring up the evidential argument from evil. Agnostics kind of play with the idea of the argument.
Talking about that?
Yeah. So I'm talking about atheists in this sense.
But would you be talking about the agnostic, or whatever you said?
Yeah. Well, I think the agnostic just comes down to weighing evidences, but we'll probably discuss some more of that as this goes on. But the whole point is this series is about dealing with the problem of evil atheists bring against Christianity, to show the fact that because their whole goal is to show that theism or Christianity in general doesn't make sense because of evil. So we're going, does it? Let's see what your arguments are, and let's bring our responses. So that's kind of the idea here. So but you guys see the problem there, where it would be someone who's saying that God cannot exist or does not exist is saying that they would, and they're saying that what God could and would do. Can you see how they're already presupposing how they think God should operate on their own terms? So it can create some difficulties there. I've had conversations with many people who are atheists, and they will instantly be like, well, if God was real, then he wouldn't have written the Bible this way. He wouldn't have used this verse for this, or they try to like kind of pick those things apart, where you go, but that's assuming that your view of God is correct, not the biblical view of God, maybe. So anyway, therefore, they say there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. Okay, and so if we really break this down, we would, let's be honest, the argument is valid, right? So it's a valid argument, but the question is whether or not all these premises are true, right? Of what God could do, what God would do. Are these premises true? Okay, that's the next question. So we could say there is no such thing as gratuitous evil. as Christians. We can be like, no, there's always a purpose behind the evil, right? That's the Reformed theodicy. The Reformed theodicy says there's a purpose behind all your evil, okay? We could also use a soul-building theodicy, that through your evil, the evil and suffering in this world, you are built up in your character and in your soul and in your moral goodness. And because evil is possible, it allows you to do a greater good with it, right? So that's a good response. We could also use the free will theodicy and just say, this is what happens when you have legitimate freedom. Because if God only let us choose that which is good, it's not real freedom. It's limited, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not true freedom. It's saying that, hey, everything the light touches, Simba, is all yours, except for that dark place over there. You can't go there. Well, then Simba's not truly free, right? He's limited within his kingdom. Okay, nice Lion King reference there for all of you. All right, so here's an example of gratuitous evil that they bring up. They call it, and these are things in the atheistic world. In these conversations, these are actually two arguments that come up all the time. Okay. So one is called the fawn, also the Bambi analogy. I prefer to call it the Bambi analogy because it's more fun that way. But this is the objection for natural evil that we call. So, and the argument goes like this. In some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. And in the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. I said relives, that's funny. But relieves its suffering. So this here is a saying, hey, there's horrible things that happen in the world. What's the purpose for this? Right? Why does Bambi have to suffer? Right? That's a pretty good question, right? And then there's the other one which deals with moral evil, which is, they just call it Sue, or the Sue analogy. Okay? And this is an actual event that took place. This is not a made-up story. This is not an analogy. And it's pretty graphic, but bear with me, okay? I'm going to walk you through then this comes up in these books a lot, okay? So this is an actual event which took place with a 5-year-old girl in Flint, Michigan, and where she was severely beaten, raped, and then strangled to death early on New Year's Day in 1986. The case was introduced by Bruce Russell, whose account of it drawn from a report in Detroit Free Press. Okay? The girl's mother was living with her boyfriend and another man who was unemployed. Her 2 children, a 9-month-old, and of course, Sue, the 5-year-old. All 3 adults were drinking at a bar, and the boyfriend was taking drugs and drinking heavily and asked to leave the bar at 8 p.m. Multiple times he was asked to leave, and finally he stopped coming back at around 9:30. The woman and the unemployed man stayed at the bar, and she finally returned home at 2 a.m., and the man went to a party, okay? But perhaps out of jealousy, the boyfriend attacked the woman when she returned home. Her brother was present and broke up the fight and knocked him out. The brother left with the man slumped over. Later, the man attacked her again, and she knocked him unconscious. After checking the children, she went to bed. Her 5-year-old girl went downstairs to the bathroom, and the unemployed man returned in the morning to find the girl dead and raped, severely beaten, and all by the boyfriend. Okay? So this is a horrible thing, right? This is a terrible thing, and that's why when Christians just go, no big deal. Like, we have to have a decent response to this, okay? And it's not very kind, right? So Rowe is so what Rowe is doing is he's using a powerful example of horrible moral evil to say the likelihood of God existing cannot be true. Okay? It's just very low that God would exist. If such a horrible thing would happen because he would prevent it. That's what he's saying. Even though we are Christians and we believe in God and have answers, the emotional problem still exists. Okay? Our theodicies, all the answers we have to understand that we can deal with the intellectual problem, the logical problem, but the emotional problem will always exist. Does that make sense? So this is emotionally affecting, but is it logically impossible for God to exist and this to happen? No, we've already demonstrated how that could work. So this is not something to be dismissed, but something to be taken seriously. But Rowe says, so Rowe also said this, the atheist said, no good state of affairs we know of is such that an omnipotent, omniscient beings obtaining it would morally justify that being's permitting of these situations. And he goes on to say, it is likely that no good state of affairs is such that an omnipotent, omniscient being's obtaining it would morally justify that being in permitting these things. And did you notice the problem there already? He says permitting these things. One of the number one issues I have in general with a lot of theology is that people go, well, God allows or permits evil. But again, if I give you permission, I permit you to take cookies from the cookie jar, or I allow you to, is it just for me to punish you? No. God does not permit it. He actually forbids it, but he gave mankind freedom, and if he gives mankind freedom, he cannot prevent. Okay? Otherwise, if he's continually preventing, he's continually infringing upon his own will. Does that make sense? And his own desires. So, anyway. So Rowe is pointing out, though, that even if one were to come up with some greater good that results from these particular evils, right, like Bambi and Sue, which represent natural evil and moral evil, it isn't really just about those two cases, but these are just the types of evil they represent, right? Right? Natural evil, moral evil, cool. But he's saying that no matter how great or good you can come up with, nothing justifies these. So therefore, God must not exist, or it's likely that God does not exist. So this is important if you want to actually steel man their case, right? You don't want to straw man it. You don't want to put it down. You want to steel man it. This is part of a charitable argumentation and being intellectually honest in your argumentation, okay? So you have to understand these and know how to respond to them, as I've mentioned. So now let's talk about another atheist named Stephen Wickstra and his what we call the Cornea argument. I'm going to read this technical jargon, then I'm going to give you the translation, okay? He says H, which is the person making the argument, is entitled to infer there is no X, and X represents greater good. Only if it is reasonable for H to believe that if there were an X, it is likely that she would perceive or find, grasp, comprehend, or conceive it. Translation. Sorry, this is not, I apologize. Stephen Wickstra is not an atheist. I apologize. So translation, he says, basically, it's only fair for you to say there's no greater good if you are in a position that you can tell if there is no greater good. That's the translation here. Okay? So this is a theist going, well, hold on, all right? Let's calm down for a second. So, I apologize right here. So he says this, like when it comes to parents and babies. If we think carefully about the sort of being theism proposes for our belief, it is entirely expectable, given that we know of our cognitive limits, that the goods by virtue of which the being allows known suffering should be very often beyond our ken. Let me translate. Basically, if you have a baby and she doesn't understand anything and you put her in a corner, she does not understand why you're putting her there and that there is a greater good for it, right? She might not understand that maybe I, as her father, am trying to make her a better person and investing in her future. But from her perspective, she just thinks I'm being really mean right now, right? That's really what it is. It's like, you're just a mean person. Dad, I hate you, right? You've ruined my life, the whole 9 yards, right? But they don't understand because they don't have the full perspective, right? This is why the Bible does such a useful thing where it calls God our Heavenly Father, because it's trying to give us an analogy and how we can understand how God interacts with us. We might not have the bigger picture, but God, when he puts us in the corner and we're suffering and we think there's no way this could ever be good, we don't have the bigger picture in mind. God is working for something, and we might not see it, right? That's why we're supposed to trust him trust him as our Father, as children trust their fathers. So your child might not understand when you put them in the corner, for example, that you're investing in her future. So again, she can't grasp daddy's mind in this. So she sees the suffering and you see the greater picture. If there is an ant, this is another one, if there's an ant crawling across, this screen here, the ant has no reason to be able to possibly understand it's walking across a screen, right? It's just kind of hanging out. It doesn't really understand what's all going on. So again, our cognitive abilities, we are humans, we are finite creatures, and we live in a very particular perspective, right? We have our own, what we call lived experience, right? We have our own lived experiences, so our cognitive abilities are so limited that we can't maybe fully see everything, or even the greater picture. That's why we just have to philosophize and understand where might not be contradictions. So, however, what's the point of complaining about anything? And this is my other issue. What's the point of complaining about anything if God did not give true freedom or heaven or soul building? Simply put, man is not really in a position to see what greater goods fully happen in all these situations. God might have been creating this world where evil is possible for particular reasons that we don't fully understand from our perspectives. Does that make sense? Now, this isn't fideism. This isn't don't think, just believe. We've already addressed multiple theodicies that bring answers to this. But we don't have the full picture in mind, right? Because we have a particular lived, limited experience. Very good. Now, I'm going to talk about a ridiculous example, but I hope you guys can have fun with me. So I have two fun examples. One is gold on Pluto. You've heard me talk about this as people have been like, well, how do we even measure that? I'm like, exactly. So let's see. Man must determine what he is in a position to determine. One is not in a position to determine, even with a telescope, to determine whether there is gold on Pluto. However, if there were a second moon orbiting Earth, then man should be able to determine that it is there. The point is that the claim that there is not some greater good behind God's creating a world where evil is possible is like claiming that there is no gold on Pluto and not like claiming that there is no second moon. Sorry, in Pluto, and not like claiming that there is no second moon. So, you get the idea? I am not in a position here on Earth to tell you whether or not gold exists on Pluto. Just like I am not in a position here what the full greater good of all those things would be, because I am a particular limited human being. So there is no way to conclude if there's gold on Pluto. You can't even say that there's not, but you are in a position to say there's not a second moon, right? We can look and go, well, we know we only have one moon, we don't have two. So I'm in a position to where I can actually say that that doesn't exist, but I can't necessarily say that there's no gold on Pluto. Okay? So I have a certain limited experiences. Okay? So you can make an observation of such things, but we do not necessarily have the greater picture. And now some of you guys are like, this gold on Pluto conversation is very strange, very weird. Can we talk about something a little bit more applicable? Every man in this room, you're going to hate me, but you're also going to relate to me here in 2 seconds. The refrigerator. A man's worst nightmare. One might open the door of the refrigerator and determine that there is no there's no can of Diet Coke. But he might not be in the position to see it clearly. How many of you guys have had a similar conversation? The man goes, man, there is no way, and he's absolutely convinced that there is no Diet Coke in the fridge. And he goes, babe, we have no Diet Coke in the fridge. And she goes, no, it's in there. Go look. And you go, it's not there. I've looked over and over again. It is not there. And the woman goes, she goes, guess I'm going to have to get up and go get it myself, right? And you're like, come on, yeah, sure, show me right now where the Diet Coke is, right? And you're like, and every man is always sitting there so confident, like, I already know, it's not here. I've looked, I've searched through this whole thing, I've looked at every shelf, there's no Diet Coke in the fridge.
And my hands are cold.
And so you go, yeah, you know what, come here, you show me. And the woman with a giant eye roll, without even looking, right? She just walks to it and almost out of thin air reaches in and pulls out a perfect can of chilled Diet Coke. And you're standing there like an idiot, like, I know you cheated and you had that up your sleeve. I know for a fact that I searched high and low and there's no Diet Coke. So, as much of a joke this is, I think this can at least give us a little bit of a perspective on it. We go, man, there's no reason for any of this evil to exist at all. Well, maybe we're just the dumb husband looking in the fridge and we don't have the full picture yet. But God is the one who made all these things possible, and he's going, no, there is. You just don't know because you have not seen all that I have seen. Make sense? So, because again, he's the Heavenly Father. He's omniscient. He knows all things. We know only our lived experience and that which we read in books, right? So, Roe is, so in a sense, we could say that William Roe is kind of like the husband in this analogy. He says there's no greater good in here, and Wykstra says, yes, there is, you just can't see it. That's what the answer is. So this handles the argument of gratuitous evil because, okay, yeah, that horrible story with Sue, that horrible story of Bambi, Those are bad things, but we might not be in a position to see all the things. But also, keep in mind, what does God do with even little children? Well, what that happened to Sue was so terrible, but he calls them unto himself. So that child, even though suffered here, is now in the presence of God. So that's why we said the heaven theodicy is something we have to remember. This is a temporary place of evil and suffering. It's temporary. It is not eternal. This is not forever. So we sometimes forget that. And again, the free will theodicy, soul building, and heaven theodicy, I think, can handle gratuitous evil as well just fine. Now I am actually making better time than I expected to. All right, so then there's Bayes' theorem. Don't you love how they always complicate things with fun names? So this is an attempt to demonstrate probability. This is actually a very strange argument. The evidential argument is an attempt to show that the probability of God's existence is very low based on the evidence of evil. So what they do in this Bayes' theorem, wow, words are hard, guys. Bayes' theorem relies on what they call background data in order to come to a conclusion. So let me give you an example. Someone says, and maybe this is for you Christian folk, this might be a little risque, but someone asks if your great Aunt Betty was a nightclub singer, okay? And you say that you've never heard of such a thing, but you barely knew her, but you have no reason to believe that she ever was a nightclub singer. So you go to your grandma's house, and behold, on the countertop, there is a picture of your great Aunt Betty singing in a nightclub. Before seeing the picture, you had a very low probability, right? A very low probability of thinking she was a nightclub singer. But now, after seeing the picture, you have a very high probability of her being a nightclub singer. Does this make sense? Okay? Almost like evidence changes our minds, right? Evidence changes minds. So the whole point here is they're saying, hey, based on the evidence, this is where we're at. But the problem is that they even do this weird thing that people put together formulas and even measure what they call hedonic units. Now, that might sound familiar because it sounds like hedonism, okay, which is pleasure. So they take pleasure units, how they measure such, we don't know, and try to measure how much pleasure versus pain should exist in a world while God is still existing. Of course, the biggest problem with this approach is that it is difficult to determine an a priori, if you will, or an analysis of data of likelihood of God's existence. In other words, how does one even measure hedonic units versus evil? So if I get a really good back massage, does that count as 10 hedonic units? But then if I get stuck in traffic, that's like -5. I don't understand how one even measures such a thing, right? So again, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So how does one even look into such background data? And Christians have arguments for God's existence, and if the arguments work, then that is also background data to raise against the probability of God's existence. On Monday nights, Jordan has been going through, is it Dr. Phaser? Yeah. Dr. Phaser? Okay. Dr. Phaser's is going over Thomas Aquinas' top 5 arguments for God, essentially. There's so many arguments for the existence of God that also has to count for something on that background data as well, right? So we can't just go, well, pain and pleasure. We have to also go, well, what about these other arguments? And we look at it as a general whole and then reach a conclusion. We can't just say that pain and pleasure nullifies one or the other. Does that make sense? So the problem here, it fails to establish an a priori or a way to analyze the data. So when someone is saying hey, based on all the evil in the world, I don't think it's very possible that God exists, then all you have to do is ask them, how do you even measure it? What level of evil versus what level of good can you even make such a claim? Would God have to limit to the only bad that people can do is lie? So now you're at, but then you ask them, what?
Or how do they define evil?
Yeah, I'm about to get to that. Kelly, you're ahead of me. So now let me do something that also, by the way, at the end of this series, do you mind doing your 2 views of God one more time so we can record it? That'd be great. But this will be, and I'm sure Jordan will have some things he wants to interject if he can. But so what I want to do here is, because one of the biggest problems with the Reformed theodicy, with a lot of Christian responses and a lot of atheist responses, that no one has a very consistent view of God. that is one of the biggest issues that we run into, which is why there's a lot of objections. So remember, God cannot do that which is logically contradictory. That would be incoherent, right? We identify falsehood by contradictions. Right? That's how we do it. If the Bible contradicted itself, we would say the Bible is false, right? And that's one of the reasons why we can do that with the Quran. But anyway, God does not make bad things, right? He only makes good things because he is perfectly good, right? And remember, he looked at all things he created and said it was very good, right? So God did not create evil. Evil is simply the opposite of good. So this is not Augustine who says evil just does not exist. It's just the absence of good. This is not saying in the Reformed view that, in a sense, that God caused evil, but he's neither the author of evil, and also he is still good and he has a purpose in evil. This is saying that God did not create evil. It's merely the opposite of good. Okay? God created free creatures because freedom is good. Right? Because if he's all good, he created all good things. He created mankind with freedom. He said it's all very good. Well, then one can conclude that freedom is good. So in order for freedom to exist, evil has to be possible. And I'm going to emphasize again, not allowed, not permitted. Stop using that language. It confuses people. They're like, well, God allows it? Well, why would God allow it? I don't allow evil in my home, right? I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't, right? I wouldn't allow somebody to kill someone in my home. I'm going to stop it. Well, God doesn't allow it, but because of freedom, he has to make it possible. God could not stop evil, for to do so, he would have to rob freedom and contradict himself. Now, you might go, but God, we see God interject in Scripture, right?
Can I just point out one thing?
Yes.
It's important to distinguish between the first sin.
Yep.
And,
I knew where you're going with that.
And now.
Yep.
So, like, yeah, I mean,
yeah, you're
like
good.
when you're talking about Bambi in the forest and, rape of a small child, that's after sin has already come in.
Right.
So,
Yep.
yeah, just remember
very good.
Distinguish between the two.
That's usually what, that is a good thing to do. So,
Yeah,
exactly.
so on that slide, you're talking about the first sin,
Right.
not all sin.
Yeah, good.
Or all evil.
Thank you. I'll have to make an addendum to make sure that becomes even clearer. Because, yes,
Because your earlier stuff, you're all talking about after evil has already come into the world.
Right.
That's a different discussion.
Right, exactly. Good call. So, but even with the existence of evil, greater good can overcome it, right? So now, to bring up Jordan's point, when God created all things, that's just the reality, right? He could not stop Adam because he gave Adam freedom. Now, after the fall, and after evil has come into the world, even with the existence of evil, greater good can overcome it. Souls can be built up and made better and stronger because of evil. And moral evil must be possible so that genuine freedom is given and soul building is possible. And this also deals with moral evil, right? So that answers moral evil. Moral evil must be possible so that genuine freedom is given and soul building is possible. That answers moral evil. However, after the fall, when mankind was exiled from Eden, they were also exiled from its protection. And now nature is even hostile toward mankind, right? There's thorns and thistles from the ground. It'll be hard to work for you. There'll be more pain and childbirth, things like that. That deals with natural evil. So, genuine human freedom can deal with moral evil, and after the fall, deals with natural evil. But both of these evils were foreign to God's creation and were brought in by hostile forces that we would call Satan, right? Mm-hmm. Satan was the one who corrupted the earth. God did not create it that way. God did not create it that way. His plan did not include it. He didn't want it. Okay? Period. God is good. He only desires that which is good. So if God exists, and this is the other thing, the moral argument, and this is what Cal was getting at. If God exists, objective, which means true for everyone, absolute moral values and duties exist. And we know today that the rape of a small child, like we talked about with Sue, is objectively bad. So therefore, objective, absolute moral values and duties do exist. Everyone knows this and accepts that. But therefore, God has to exist. Because if God does not exist, you've already heard me talk about this, we are an accident. It's a space accident. We have no objective moral values to measure. So another thing to bring up is somebody saying that all the evil and suffering makes it impossible for God to exist. Then one is actually hard-pressed to complain about evil and suffering if God does not exist. while also asserting that God does not exist because of the evil and suffering. Because the very notion that evil exists and suffering is bad is some form of measurement system to claim it is objectively wrong or unfair. This is where C.S. Lewis, I'm going to walk over here real fast. You guys might remember this. Do you guys ever remember his lion analogy? So, and one of the biggest arguments for it, C.S. Lewis, of course, was an atheist. He was he was a very strong atheist. But he said one of the biggest things that changed his mind, this one worked good, was that he looks in the world, and he saw the world, and saw all the moral crookedness, right? He saw this line and how crooked it was, how messed up everyone was. But then he goes, what made him ask the question was, well, how do I even know the line is crooked unless I have a straight line by which to measure it? So if I'm saying all these things are evil, then that must mean I must know what good is, right? If I'm saying these things are evil, I must say something is good. But then where does good come from? If we are just a space accident where things just happened, then we are an accident. And accidents do not have purpose. If they don't have purpose, they don't have value. If they don't have value, they don't have good or evil. Does that make sense? It's an accident. When you get rear-ended, you don't say the person who rear-ended you is evil. You say it's an accident, right? You didn't see me there. So that is the problem. So when someone is complaining about evil and suffering in the world, they're missing the fact that, guys, you are still having to measure against something that's an objectively straight line, and that only can come from a being who is timeless, formless, and is all perfectly good, what we call God. Does that make sense? So again, that right there, so the problem of evil and suffering, you can actually almost always bring it to that, this is one of the simplest ways you can go about it. However, I think having all the other background knowledge that we have is helpful as well. Does that make sense? So, any questions or comments? Because that is the last bit, which means I only went 5 minutes over, even though we started late. I am really happy about that, by the way. Woo! Yay! Anything? Anyone have any comments? Ben.
Well, I'm not sure your line is straight.
Shut up. You know, when I drew that, I was like, someone's going to be smart in this room to say this is not a straight line. Thanks for being that
It
guy,
was
Ben.
bothering me, but I wasn't going to say anything.
Yeah, well, I don't have a ruler.
Why you
And if someone
want?
rear-ended me, I'd call them evil too. So
That's just straight into a concrete law for psychology evil too.
yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious. So, next week, we're going to talk about the problem of hell. We're going to talk about the problem of hell, the doctrine of hell. If God is good, why is there hell? Does that make sense? Sweet. Very good.